Good morning. Welcome to the Presidential Symposium of the annual meeting of Universitas 21. This is a symposium that is hosted by all the presidents of the 25 or so institutions that form the network of leading research universities in the world, committed to transformative change in the 21st century. And the topic chosen for today, and I will make some brief remarks before turning it over to our keynote speaker. The topic that has been chosen as the theme for the Presidential Symposium is globalization, isolationism, and the response in higher education. And higher education means the response of the network of these global research and innovation universities. So as I was thinking about what to say, what was crossing my mind was that poem by Yeats, written shortly after the First World War, The Second Coming. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. I wonder if that captures the moment today. Because I think of all the challenges that face us in higher education globally, this is perhaps one of almost existential crisis in terms of the fundamental values of universities, of their search for truth, of civil discourse, of collaboration. And I was, if you will indulge me for a moment, I was reflecting on my own experience as an immigrant to this country. I grew up in South America, in Peru. My family were there. They took me there when I was a baby. And so I consider myself a Latasian, a Latino Asian, who spoke Chinese at home, Spanish in school, speak Chinese with a Spanish accent. And my parents were political refugees. So at the age of 15, they gave me $300, their life savings. And they said to me, go to America. I didn't know anybody here. I didn't speak the language. They could not accompany me because this country had a racial quota on people who came into America. But I came as a student. So I arrived here at the age of 15. And as I look back, and having to, given this topic, it just brought back all these memories. And it occurs to me that I have lived in this country, in this world, through three fundamental paradigms. When I came to this country, we were a microcosm of Europe. What that means is that the dominant ideology was assimilation. In fact, the metaphor was a melting pot, that somehow people from all over the world, primarily from Europe, will all be molded together. We will be a nation of homogenized citizens. Then, by the late 60s, a new paradigm started emerging. It's not assimilation, but it's multiculturalism. That we began to recognize that we were not only a microcosm of Europe, but perhaps we were becoming a microcosm of the world, a universal nation, a nation of nations. But in celebrating the diversity or the emerging diversity of this country, the question I always ask myself, so now the metaphor is not a melting pot, it is a mosaic. People from all different backgrounds, separate tiles, all shining brightly and separately in this mosaic, and what is the glue that holds everything together? And then we come to the third period of the time I've been here, and this began probably in the past 6 or 7 years. And that is from assimilation to multiculturalism to tribalism, where we are so divided as a country in America. And I believe that division, that we're separated by tribes, where the principal emotion is resentment and outrage, magnified by social media instantly and virally, a technology that was designed to bring us together is pulling us apart. And in this environment, where there are divisions by race, by culture, by geography, by politics, by economic status, when after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we went into 25 years of unprecedented prosperity, lifted millions of people out of poverty, but at the same time, at least in this country and developed countries, we have incredible accumulation of wealth that has not been spread equally among the population. And you have people in this country and elsewhere in the world, developed countries, who feel left behind. You have the yellow vests in France. You have Brexiteers in, well, Britain. And we have this refrain, to make America great again, which is code for looking back to a mythical past that perhaps never existed, to make America white and Christian again. This rise of nativist populism is, I believe, an existential threat. It challenges the soul and the heart of the democratic values that underlie an academic institution. I don't know what the solution is. I do know that this is a crying need where all of us, as members of leading research universities, need to address. And to launch this in this conversation, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Allan Goodman. He is the 6th president of the Institute for International Education, and you well know this organization. It is the leading not-for-profit organization focused on international education exchanges. It manages, for example, the Fulbright program, and many, many of the people who've gone through the programs of IIE. There have been 78 Nobel Prize winners. Mr. Goodman got his PhD in government from Harvard. He has over a dozen honorary degrees. I won't recite all of them. He has been honored with the Legion of Honor by France and the Royal Norwegian Order of Merit. And I'm proud to say he's the first recipient of the U21 Gilbert Medal for Internationalism. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Goodman.
It's a privilege to follow President Loh, and I very much appreciate him sharing his journey with us and his perspective, and he also gave the first half of my speech. We didn't collaborate in advance, but the themes are very similar. Nothing is as special as getting a Gilbert Medal, especially if you get it at Lund, where the first ceremony was, and it began with people marching in academic regalia and wonderful chain links of their office, and a group of women on a balcony blowing trumpets, and then a speech and the ceremony, and then a lovely dinner. And at the end of it, my daughter said, "I think Dad just got made Pope." So I hope when Lund again hosts a ceremony, it will be as memorable as the one that my family and I had. It was indeed a high honor. You know the title of my talk, so I need to give you a spoiler alert at the very beginning. I am not going to forecast the end of history, the end of internationalization, but conclude by suggesting it's needed more than ever in the world we share, and your universities and your leaderships are really on the front lines of making the world we'd like to see happen, both Wallace and I would like to see happen, come to life in this century, no matter how difficult. It's interesting to reflect on the year since 2012 when the first medal was awarded, what has happened in our field, and there's some reason for optimism. The number of internationally mobile students grew since 2012 from about 4 million to 5 million, and OECD estimates we are on the road to maybe 8 million internationally mobile students by the year 2025. I actually think, for reasons I'll suggest later, that's a very low estimate. China became a major destination country. This next year, it will surpass probably the United Kingdom in the number of international students that it hosts. We've never had a situation before where the world's leading sending country is the second largest receiving country, with an interesting dynamic for the future. Who teaches the students that come to China? People with American PhDs. In fact, there's been so much return to China, there are more people with American PhDs teaching in China than in America, including our citizens and the citizens of other countries. So internationalization is like, I thought, the universe. It's constantly expanding, and it's accelerating rather than decelerating. Number of branch campuses abroad in the period since the first Gilbert Medal to now have doubled. And for the first time in several years, the United States has hosted more than 1 million international students in our country. But a dozen other countries, many represented here, have a declared foreign policy objective to double their numbers of international students enrolled by the year 2025. So an expanding universe, one we all hope for, one with very different dimensions and definitions of internationalization. And at the same time, as Wallace foreshadowed, maybe the glass is not entirely half full, and there are some people actively writing now suggesting that the glass is way less than half empty. The most recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about internationalization, which is a very nuanced and balanced article, has a non-nuanced headline, which is the golden age of internationalization has lost its sheen and may be over. And around the world, there are also those indications, all of them indexed by the isms we are all worried about today. Nationalism creeping into curricula, nationalism keeping people out, closing doors. Nativism, tribalism does have an impact on the internationalization and international education we all support. It caused me to reflect on the centennial of IIE. We're 100 years old this year. We're doing a book, it'll come out in October, and I made the mistake of saying we ought to have a timeline in the book. Start in 1919, go up to 2018, 2019, but the real mistake was I said, and I'll do it. The timeline is now longer than the text of the book itself, because I couldn't figure out And every year we did an annual report. Every year it was about 100 pages long, so I read every one of them. And I couldn't figure out what to leave out because it all seemed so important. But what was striking about each of them from 1920 onward is that most of them begin with, this is a really tough time for our field. It's a really tough time to promote international education. There is this ism and that ism that is affecting what we can do. Budgets are scarce, budgets are being cut. And so many of the reports, especially from 1930 to 1960, 1970, you could take a whole page out of it, put it in a blog today, and you wouldn't be able to tell whether it is written in 2019 or 1940 or 39 or 52. And I said to myself, we must have had some good years. We have. We had 4 good years where the presidents of IIE said everything was good. Numbers were up, budgets were up, popular attitudes were welcoming of internationalization efforts and international students. The first good year was 1928. It didn't last, as you might suspect, but the director noticed for the first time in almost the decade we had been in existence that education was being used to regenerate countries, to provide more education to the masses of people, to create prosperity. And he was, of course, between the Depression and the rise of fascism and Nazism, only to be disappointed to see that education was used as a tool precisely to close doors, to promote tribes, to ultimately lead to war. It was a long time till the next really good year. And the next good year in our reports was 1958. The president at the time said, for the first time in several decades, all of the public opinion polls of Americans suggest that we should be deeply engaged in international relations, deeply engaged in the development of other countries, and internationalization was on an uptick. By 1959, the report began, but it isn't to be the case. Public opinion was turning. The Cold War was in full bloom. An election was looming. And so it was a very brief moment between the passage of the National Defense Education Act, which had profound impacts on budgets at all colleges and universities in America, and their international outreach. And 18 months later, we were back to the same profound pessimism. Didn't mean that you couldn't make progress and you couldn't do things in a period like that or any previous one, but it makes our job hard. And I think any president today faces great difficulty in continuing to make the case that Wallace and I would make, that internationalization is one of the best aspects of higher education and the best investment any of us can make to make the world less dangerous. 1962 was a good year. The Fulbright budget had increased substantially after President Kennedy received Fulbrighters in the Rose Garden in the White House. Made a speech about the importance of Fulbrighters being cultural ambassadors, the need for the foreign Fulbrighters to teach Americans about the places they had come from and how we're seen in the world, and the need for us to be engaged. That didn't last too long either. Kennedy was assassinated the next year, and by 1964, there broke out a tremendous acrimony between President Johnson and Senator Fulbright over the Vietnam War, which led to persistent efforts by the White House to cut the Fulbright program budget and then try to eliminate it altogether. thanks to the Congress and members of Congress who were Rhodes Scholars and Fulbright alums, it didn't happen. But it wasn't for lack of trying on LBJ's part to exact this revenge on Fulbright. 2002, finally, was the fourth year that I figured was a really great year. It follows, of course, 9/11. And one of the responses to 9/11 was a substantial increase by the Bush administration to increase public diplomacy and especially increase the Fulbright program. And the administration restored in 2002, 2003, much, if not all, of the cuts that it had made over the past 20 years and brought Fulbright to the level that it is today. Because in our situation, any program that shows enormous growth is the target of efforts to say, well, if you're growing so much and you had X before and now you have X plus this year, maybe we can take more from the plus. You don't really need it because you've been happy at the level you had. And Fulbright became and other public diplomacy programs that were increased in budget became a constant target in the second Bush term and in the Obama presidency. Congress steadfastly and bipartisanly stands by the Fulbright program, and that's why it continues to be funded at the highest level in its history, even as we speak. So those were the best 4 years of our lives. But we learned that maybe the most important lesson for all of us in this business is that international educational exchange works in all weathers. It is easy to imagine public diplomacy and international exchange working well when everybody loves each other, when there's no war, when there's great prosperity, when national budgets are increasing. But every period of adversity, at least for IIE and its leaders, led to a discovery, well, if we aren't going to get it here, we can go there. If we're not able to work here, we can work in another place. And we constantly use this as a way of making it clearer and clearer how important international education exchange is to the world we share. So we come to 2019. And not only do I have to do a book, but I have to write a report. A little bit of breaking news on some of the things I'm planning on saying. First, I'm going to notice the isms. But more importantly, what we're missing too much is that there is actually an acute shortage of higher education in the world. In some of the largest countries, when you have ratios of 60 students taking the exam and qualifying to enter university for the one seat that's available, when you have hundreds of thousands of people taking national exams and the entering class is a couple of hundred, there is, despite all of the growth of education around the world and even in our own country, a shortage of education, period, and of course a shortage of internationalization opportunities. We're going to focus on some of the gaps that exist in the biggest population groups. So we're not worried that the elite students will find a place in a university in their country or abroad. We're worried about the millions of very, very gifted and qualified students who are very, very poor. And if we only educate the elite, they're not going to save us, because if we don't pay attention to the millions who are poor and find access to education for them, whether it's at traditional universities, branch campuses, or distance learning, the world is not going to be saved, and we're not going to be saved with it. So we're in that space focused on two challenges. One, where do refugees and displaced students go? through our work with the Student Emergency Platform and the Scholar Rescue Fund, we have discovered that refugee camps and the urban refugees and the displaced students contain a lot more people than just babies and women. Hundreds of thousands of university students have been disconnected from their higher education. Those who live in refugee camps for 15, 16, 17 years now complete secondary education, but they have no place to go outside the camp for a tertiary education. And so how do we help widen that access for them? Because there's a lot of them, and there will be a lot more of them in our lifetime. One is through the platform on education and emergencies, where in a virtual way we connect displaced and refugee students with the scholarships that exist, whether in the places they're at or in a nearby country, and then provide the virtual advising so that Mohammed doesn't get discouraged after they apply for the first 100 fellowships and don't get it, because there are another 100 that we can find for them. The other thing we're going to try to do, and we are in search of a donor, I also buy a lottery ticket every week, to create what I'm going to call the Roads for Refugees. Having chaired several roads committees, and of course being involved in other prestigious national fellowship programs, one of the things that strikes me is refugees don't get picked. They don't get groomed. And if they get picked, there's always a question, can they travel from where they are to take the fellowship up at Oxford or Cambridge or the Schwarzman in Beijing? So what we need is to find the Rhodes Scholars, the future leaders, the future Nobel Prize winners, the future country leaders among refugee populations, and develop the same kind of networking and educational experience for them where they are. And I hope that I'll be coming to each of your universities when we have this program launched and saying, we have a scholar, your name goes here, we'd like the scholar to be at your university and be part of this international community of refugee and displaced students who will save that part of the world. The other thing we're doing, and I'll write about some, is from the Ford International Fellows Program, the nearly 5,000 fellowships that we were, with Ford, able to provide to people historically denied education in 22 different countries. We are doing a 10-year tracking study on what happened, what difference the education made, how many finished, how many went back, what did they do when they went back, and the news is fabulous. What I worry about is we had 5,000 roughly fellowships, we had 110,000 applications. And it tells us that if you intentionally look at the very poor and the very distressed and provide them education, the chances are that they do very, very well. 99% completion rate, Olympic gold medals in math, physics, and other things, and they return to their home countries and by a factor of 2 and sometimes 10, improve the project, the social community project that first brought them to our attention. So we want to use this data to persuade admissions deans that no matter where you else are looking, make a commitment intentionally to look for the very, very poor, because they will be your best students. And it takes some effort to find a garbage picker in Indonesia who wins a gold medal in math that no one would have picked before, or an untouchable in India that no one would have thought, and even the person themselves wouldn't have thought that they might be eligible for something like this. So how do we use the data to change how we go after students so that we're intentionally widening access, intentionally going to places that we normally don't go? But if we go, we know the results here. The results of education are just phenomenal. So I also hope I will be writing finally about the United States' ability to continue to host international students, and that we will continue to be a host of more than 1 million international students. At the same time that 12 other countries are also trying to host more international students. And the effort and my writing will be focused on suggesting that this is not a zero-sum game, that the pie of talent is, like the universe, enormous and expanding all the time, and that there are international students enough for all of us. I conclude 3 things. One, maybe we never had a golden age, but we have seen the movie before. We know how hard doing the work you all are committed to doing and this network of universities is doing. We know how hard it is, but we also know it works even in very hard situations, filled with all the isms that seem to go against what we hope and aspire to achieve. Secondly, I've concluded that universities are destinations, just like countries. And they have foreign policies. And they need to have foreign policies. And it's not an alien thing. Hundreds of years ago, universities issued passports, laissez-passers in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, so that scholars and students from all over could come to centers of learning, whether it was Baghdad or Oxford and Cambridge. So universities are destinations like countries, they have foreign policies like countries, and they practice diplomacy like countries. And that diplomacy, the diplomacy of education in the education space is as needed today and tomorrow as it may ever have been. I think the end is not at hand. I think the history of international exchange in this century is going to be as interesting as in the last century. And my colleagues and I at IIE are very grateful to the relationships we have with all of your universities because together we can actually make this century the international education century. Ross, thank you so much for having me. And again, it was a high honor to be made a pope in Lund. And I wish this year's winner and in the future of the Gilbert Medal all success. Thank you.
President Goodman is agreed to field some questions. Who would like to start? Anyone? If not, maybe I can actually oil the pump here a little bit. And my question to you is, I was very moved by what I think all of us were very moved about your remarks about refugees. And the question for us, I think, as a network is, what can a network do together as a group, as a combined force to actually help address this refugee crisis?
Thank you. Everyone take one. There are 25,000 institutions of higher ed in the world. If everyone took one refugee student, maybe 2, we would begin to make a dent in the numbers that exist from Syria, from Yemen, from Venezuela, and a few other places. What you'll find, and what we consistently find, is when you connect a refugee or displaced student back to their education, they actually thrive. And we started with a small program in Jordan called Camps to Campus. And we had a lot of misgivings about doing it because some of the students applying for this had been out of school 5, 6, 7 years. And we wondered if absence from school would make a difference. It actually focused their energies, it focused their attention. They had a better idea of where they wanted to go, what they wanted to do, what they wanted to study than maybe if they were just fresh out of fleeing camp. The other thing we worried about, and you would on your campuses, is won't refugee students come with a lot of post-traumatic stress? They do. But it turns out the single refugee student that comes to your campus and is leaving a mother and 5 siblings in different camps and worrying about it, first they figure out how to take care of their siblings while they're doing their studying and get them sorted out. And we've seen nothing that we could possibly do could match it, where one reconnected student puts the mother and the siblings together, moves them to Germany, gets the younger ones in school in Germany. They become their own refugee resettlement area. Secondly, they are your most active community service volunteers. They immediately say, because of this blessing, I need to give back, and they do. And they help the next generation coming up. If I made it, here's how you could make it, here's the step to take, here's what to do. So I think we just have to get doing it. And if everyone took one displaced student, one displaced scholar, we'd first learn a great deal from our campuses and the experience, but we would also begin to make a dent in these enormous numbers that they're only going to grow.
More questions?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Gallagher from the Do-Good Institute. Thank you, President Goodman, for your remarks and for answering some of our questions.
Thanks for what you and the Institute do. I'm anxious to hear about it.
Excellent. So I was wondering, one of the challenges we face at a higher education institution is the turnover in students, just by nature of the number of years that it takes to complete a degree. Do you have recommendations for how best to engage alumni and even students while they're here to make sure that they retain the culture of the institution after they graduate and continue to give back and work with their institutions when they're in the working world?
The secret sauce is organized, intentional mentoring programs. And we just sort of woke up to it a couple of years ago when we realized through the Ford program that we have 5,000 alumni all around the world, half women, that have overcome so much thanks to their education and would love to be mentors. And we just didn't ask them. So now we are. And we focused first on can you mentor high school girls so that they complete high school, take the exam, and get into university. And we're now doing a new program to focus on women in universities. How do you go from finishing the university, taking its values, and then getting a job? Or doing good, going into a community service project. So we all ask alumni for a lot of money. But what we really can be asking them to do is to donate their time, their service, be a mentor, and there's some terrific platforms now that help facilitate that, like Kronos, which we're finding transcends time, borders, barriers, and in a 4 to 6 month program of mentorship, we are helping people get on the trajectory of getting a job. Now that's not exactly how do we keep them in touch with College Park, but it's what College Park is all about. That's why you're building out the campus so that this part of Maryland becomes a place of future jobs and it begins to look like the world, not just like Southern Maryland.
Good morning, Dan Wiener, University of Connecticut. We live in this white nationalist populist moment, but when we look on our campuses, we see a real increase in diversity. And when you look under the hood of the diversity change, some of these students, a lot of these students are actually the children of immigrants, and they're thriving. So one of the things that concerns me is that when we look at statistics and we look at trends and we look at the crystal ball, we don't spend enough attention on the fact that the people that came here previously and their children and their grandchildren are doing extremely well, which really helps to globalize our campuses. How do we get a better feeling for that and celebrate that a little bit more?
We always start with the Nobel Prizes because half of all the Americans that won Nobel Prizes were born in another country. And for every community and every constituency, whether it's in Stores or Bloomington, Indiana, the Internationalization Office, the press office, and the president can find a purchase point to say, this is why inclusion and internationalization is important to Indiana University. This is why it's important in Connecticut. This is how it contributes. And it is a retail business. You have to sell internationalization every day. I'm sure you have to do it on your campuses. You have to have the data. But you should be meeting every month with the editorial board of newspapers in your state, in your constituency, to point up the value of what the university is because it's open to the world and because it reflects the world. And I think we're going to have, it is a retail business and every sale is important, but you're not going to make a sale if you don't go out and do it. So I think it really changes the optic of what you do with, for example, the Open Doors data or the NAFSA data on what students spend in, international students spend in a local constituency, because most people don't still understand that.
Anton Muscatelli, University of Glasgow. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Goodman, for a really inspiring and illuminating speech. I mean, my question was about what we do for refugees and what we do for the generation immediately after, which in a sense follows on slightly from the previous question. We've set up a number of scholarships at the University of Glasgow around refugees, given the various crises that have hit Europe. We have a UNESCO's chair and a centre around refugee studies. But it's struck us, it's actually quite interesting, partly because of the number of Syrian refugees particularly who've come to Scotland. There is actually, and indeed from other parts of West Africa, we actually have also a large number of children of refugees, and their needs are slightly different. It isn't literally the need of, I don't have any money to pursue my education, because most of them will have their education paid for once they acquire refugee status, but they do need a lot of support. And I was just, wondering whether you have any reflections on that. There's two different groups in a sense. One is the immediate, what you do for refugees, and what you do for really those who are the children of, and they require different and targeted support, and it's quite different in many respects.
Thank you. It's a question we worry about a lot, but universities also have some of the solution if you have degree programs in early childhood education. What we're learning is that the trauma of being a refugee child is different than a lot of other traumas. My daughter, the one who thought I was being made Pope, is now a pediatrician here at Children's Hospital in Washington, writing a textbook on refugee children medicine, pediatrics, because the current pediatrics texts don't actually understand and encompass what a refugee child faces. So I'm thinking between what the medical practitioner community can do and universities that have early childhood education programs, we can study now how to help this group and what are their special needs. And because that population is only going to grow, it can be a real contribution to both the practice of medicine, but also the practice of community health in all of our countries.
Alan, thank you. David Eastwood, University of Birmingham. I was thinking of our experience in the UK, and most UK universities are part of CARA, which you will know, which was set up in the 1930s to work with displaced academic scholars, initially from Germany, and is now global. And
we still work closely with CARA unfortunately, it's still very much needed.
Well, indeed, and going back, in fact, to your opening remarks, it's needed more than ever. And so I was thinking about the challenges that we have given the demand through a scheme like CARA, and the challenges that you refer to when we're talking about refugees and first chance in university. And my question, which is the tough one that we face, is how do we choose and who chooses, given the scale of the demand?
It's really a Solomonic-like decision, unfortunately. And what we've learned is, as hard as it is, you never regret choosing someone, because that person will do something with their lives because of your open door, your scholarship, the education they get, and they will lift the lives of 10, 100 other people because of that opportunity they get. We, through the peer platform, we try to match rather than choose. That's a little different than the problem that you face, but if we can get Mohammed or Fatma into a country and a school, that all the logistics work, we think there's a 90% chance it's going to work well on both sides. That's a little different than saying we have an elaborate essay contest and an elaborate admissions process, because making the choices is so difficult. And what we didn't want to see is the opportunity go vacant when the student is out there. But they, why I hope I will win the lottery is that we will come to you with the full fellowship for an outstanding refugee student. You will take that student. Together we'll learn how well they do, and they will show us how to choose, how to access, how to get to the next group, because I know we can't do it sitting in New York or Washington or London. So I think we have a lot to learn from the students we admit, and every one of those lessons will help us figure out how we do more and make better choices.
We're going to take one last question. It'll be Ignacio.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Ignacio Sanchez from Chile. Our country increased from 1% migrants to 7% in 15 years, mostly from Latin America, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia. And we are facing the tension between the migrants and the first native population, that many times they don't have access to higher education. There's a competition, there's a tension from the first native, that in Chile are about 10% of the population, of competing for opportunities. How do you see that balance between opening doors to migrants and opening opportunities to first native?
If I were president of a university in a society like we have, or like Chile has, or like many other countries, I would make sure that the admissions department chooses inclusively and commits us to having students from this sector of society, this type of migration system, Native Americans, Native populations. And I find if you don't look around the room and say, you know, there's something missing here. It's like planning meetings you have when all the people sitting there are men. You've got to say, we don't have the meeting until we have actually a room that looks like the problem we're trying to address or the world we're trying to serve. And that's why for us, each one take one is, if you're intentional about taking a refugee student, you will. And if you're intentional about inclusion, that will happen. But it has to be the DNA of everybody else serving the institution and the president.